All right, so yes, I am Sergeant Tyler Bechtel with the Oregon State Police. I've been a police officer now for about 10 years, and that's taught me a couple of things. One of them is the disclaimer. It's very important to let you know that I'm here with my own personal views, and these aren't necessarily the views of the Oregon State Police, and this does not constitute legal advice. So that's one of the first lessons you learn as a cop is leave yourself way out. So we're going to start with the history. We're going to go way back in the Wayback Machine and start all the way back with marijuana in the United States. And I'm going to touch on this really quick. I talk fast, so slow me down if you need to, and raise your hand if you have a question. I like the style of doing that too. So cannabis, marijuana, it's been around for a long time. It's been around for a long time as cannabis. And we'll talk about when it becomes marijuana here in a second. But 1906, that's the first federal bill that we see that deals with cannabis. And it's a labeling requirement. Simply that. You just got to let people know that cannabis is in there. Well, you might think that medical marijuana is new in Oregon if you've lived here your whole life like I have. New to me is 1998, but no, we had a medical marijuana bill all the way back in 1923, and it was also about labeling and letting people know in medical preparations that they had marijuana. Interestingly enough, there's two popular strains of marijuana. There's a third one out there that's less popular and it doesn't contain a lot of THC, but we have indica and sativa. I think of it this way: indica, couch, and sativa, because indica is more of a depressant effect. It's gonna put you to sleep. It's gonna keep you in the couch. Sativa, more of a stimulant effect. But anyway, so they're concerned about crime, and they make the distribution of non-medical indica a crime. 1935, Oregon House Bill 107 makes all cannabis illegal except for the medical preparations. So this is the first time that we start to talk about dosing in Oregon, and we limit it to 32 milligrams per ounce of a medical preparation. Also in the 1930s, something happens. We don't have the DEA yet in the United States, but we have this, name escapes me, this particularly zealous Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. And he starts thinking about the evils of marijuana, and some people think because Prohibition possibly ending around that time, he was looking for more work for the Treasury, because keep in mind, they collected taxes. So he starts demonizing cannabis and coins the term, or uses the term first and most recognizably, marijuana. So that's when we start calling it marijuana. In 1941, we make it all cannabis illegal in Oregon. And then in 1951, we start getting into federal mandatory minimum sentences, and this is the first instance of mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes. Now, in 1970, we have a federal House bill. What it does is it starts to focus on rehabilitation, and for the first time, marijuana receives a schedule treatment. Mr. Whitford, of course, pointed out that Schedule I drugs on the DEA schedule have no medical use. So that's pretty important to note. You might hear a lot about the opioid crisis and fentanyl. Fentanyl deaths are on the rise. Well, fentanyl is Schedule II because it has a medical use. So you have something like fentanyl that, a grain of salt will kill you as a Schedule II drug, and marijuana, big bad evil marijuana, cannabis, is a Schedule I drug. So it's maybe out of line with how we feel here in Oregon. So moving on, 1973, this is huge. We become the first state to decriminalize marijuana in certain amounts. So if you have less than 1 ounce of marijuana, this is, by the way, the year I was born. If you have less than 1 ounce of marijuana, it's now a traffic ticket. It's a violation. So that's huge. If you think about it, when you go back to 1970 and the DEA putting it on Schedule I, and just 3 years later, Oregon saying that, well, if you have less than an ounce, it's not that big of a deal. So 1984 comes around, and Federal Senate Bill 1792 brings back the federal mandatory minimums that they got rid of in 1970. And then a few years later, they changed the mandatory minimums again, and this is what they are today. If you have 100 plants, you're going to end up doing a minimum of 5 years in the federal penitentiary. And it's important to know that federal time is different than state time. If you get sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary and you do 2 years, that's probably not unheard of. Federal time is not like that. If you're sentenced to 5 years, you do 5 years. So it's important to think about this in context, because we have many, many, many gardens, both licit and illicit, regulated in Oregon, that have well over 100 plants. And technically, they are still subject to that 5-year mandatory minimum, except for a federal guidance that everyone operates under right now called the Cole Memorandum. And that was written by Assistant Attorney General James Cole in 2013, I believe. And there's 8 points on that Cole Memorandum that basically says to federal law enforcement, hey, hands off these states with regulated systems unless it's one of these 8 things. And those are access by minors, drugged driving, organized crime, violence. So there's 8 factors that the feds are going to look at you if you're breaking one of those 8 guidance rules, but otherwise, hands off. So let's see, Oregon's medical marijuana. That happens in 1998, and that was a ballot measure. It passed by 55%, and it allows medical marijuana with limits. So, and I think medical marijuana-wise, I think we were the 2nd or 3rd state. We were right behind California, which was the 1st. And we start to get into present day. It's just kind of been a flurry since about 2005. And a lot of this has paved the path for recreational legalization. When we passed the law in 1998, you could have 3 ounces, and all of a sudden in 2005, you could have 24 ounces. So big difference. You went from 3 ounces to basically 2 pounds. We went from 3 plants to 6 plants. In 2009, Oregon, realizing that it was kind of ridiculous to have marijuana as a Schedule I drug, moved it down to Schedule II just for Oregon's controlled substances schedule. Keep in mind that in most cases, Oregon's controlled substances schedule is in line with the DEA's, but there's a few deviations, and this is one of them. Another popular one I can think of is tramadol. Tramadol was a drug that came to popularity about 4 years ago, and it was completely unscheduled. It was a prescription medication, but it was down low, Schedule 4 or 5 or something like that. Well, we ended up seeing a lot of impaired driving and crashes related to it, and then the states, one by one, started to put tramadol on their drug schedules, and I think since then the feds have done the same. And tramadol incidentally keeps my 11-year-old bulldog running around, so it's got bad hips. So maybe I should try medical marijuana with him, though, right? Yeah, exactly. So where were we? 2013. Now this, as I say that medical laws kind of paved the way for recreational marijuana, in 2013 we allowed for medical dispensaries. We allowed all these shops to pop up on the corner. At that time, it was still written that they could only get reasonable reimbursements for their costs, right? So I always wondered how they're just going for a reimbursement when it's like 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and why is that 25-year-old here at midnight on Thanksgiving, is it because he believes in people's access to medication, or is there a profit motive? I believe there's a profit motive, and there probably was, because the lobby came to power, and as the lobby came to power, we got ballot measure 91, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So I guess 20 minutes, and I'm just now up to speed here. So ballot measure 91, incidentally, passed with 56%. If you think about medical marijuana in 1998 passing with 55% to recreational passing in 56%, you can still see that Oregonians kind of have the same feeling and the same percentages about marijuana. So ballot measure 91 was written by marijuana proponents. It wasn't written by the law enforcement field. It wasn't written by the legislature, so there was a lot of problems with it. For instance, the distributions, I think 20% was going to state schools, or 40%, a huge amount, going to state schools. Well, they named the State Schools Fund, which is actually a trust fund that only disperses a small amount every year. The idea was to give 40% to schools, not 40% to a trust fund that would live in perpetuity and only trickle out dollars over time. So things like that needed to be tweaked. In fact, they had to tweak it 8 times in well, I guess 9 times in the first year and a half. So in Oregon, their legislature meets in odd years in a long session, in a normal session, and then in even years it meets in a short session. And we just started meeting in a short session, 4 or 5 years ago. So it's kind of new that we make laws every other year. We're now making them every year, and we're just compacting it on the even years. So they got a lot done in that first long session and in the second session. And they set some possession limits that weren't set. They addressed things that hadn't been addressed, like the manufacture of butane honey oil, for one, wasn't addressed in Measure 91. But it needed to be addressed because we started to see a rise in home explosions. So they started working on that stuff, and the result of that, us cops, it wasn't written in the book, it was written in a law somewhere on the web, and if it's not in our handy-dandy pocket guide, it doesn't exist. If you have to read for 15 to 20 minutes on the side of the road to determine whether or not you've got a crime, then you should probably just let the person go, because you're treading lightly on an unlawful seizure of a person. So we kind of had a hands-off approach. It started changing so rapidly that your average police officer who can't keep up with reports couldn't keep up with the laws. So in 2015 and 2016, it kind of created a moving target. And oftentimes the prosecutors were just as confused as the police officers. So we come to this year. February to July of this year, we had our long session. We had the Joint Marijuana Committee, or as sometimes called the Joint Committee, that met, and they dealt with all marijuana laws. And in fact, they had 28 marijuana-related bills introduced to them. 6 of them called for the end to Oregon medical marijuana program. They wanted it to be housed under one regulatory authority. How marijuana works today in Oregon is we have the Oregon Medical Marijuana Program. We have the adult use regulation through OLCC. That's also called recreational marijuana. Then we have hemp. That's through the Oregon Department of Agriculture. And it's important to note that hemp, we thought, was going to be grown like corn, really tight together in tall stalks and used for fiber. And really what our hemp farmers are doing is growing it for CBD, which is a non-psychoactive cannabinoid. So they're growing it just like marijuana. So you might drive down and see like the largest marijuana farm you've ever seen in your entire life, and it looks like marijuana, smells like marijuana, probably tastes like marijuana, I don't know. But at the end of the day, it has no THC in it, or it has less than 0.03%. So of those 28 marijuana-related bills, only 8 of them passed. And that's good. A lot of them were duplicating each other, but let's take a look at some of the more important ones that passed. Let's see, going down the line here, Senate Bill 56, I don't even remember. Senate Bill 302, this is important. We're going to talk about that because it switched around some possession limits, but it also removed marijuana from Oregon's Controlled Substances Act. And that becomes important for a lot of reasons. Senate Bill 303, the minor in possession bill, that one was an easy fix because you could get caught as a minor with alcohol in your car and you would lose your driver's license, your provisional driver's license, but if you had marijuana, it was okay. So we needed to bring those two penalties in line. Senate Bill 1015, that dealt with transferring hemp. You can move hemp across state lines. Federal law is very ambiguous on it. There's the Right to Farm Act that says that you can do it, but there's the DEA that says you can't, and then there's the Budget Appropriations Act that says the federal authorities will stay away from hemp if the hemp's moving from one state to another state and both states have a system of control. So it's really ambiguous about that, but in Oregon, you can transfer hemp, and more importantly, you can transfer that hemp that you're growing for the CBD oil to a OLCC processor to have it processed into CBD oil. Yes, sir.
So the only sort of defining thing of transferring hemp, since you can't really recognize it for its content of THC when transferring across state lines, and you obviously have to have some very good documentation.
Yeah, and you're going to have to ask some very good questions if you're an officer, to be quite honest. I kind of, I've been the point of contact for marijuana-related questions in the law enforcement community for about a year and a half now, and I still get that on a regular basis, and frankly, we really don't, there's no set documentation. So if a person has, in fact, when I have questions about this, I call the hemp industry and I ask them, hey, what's up? Well, I'll show you what we do. And they'll have a bill of lading and a manifest, just like your commercial motor vehicle would. You know, those take all different forms. So they have to have basic information in them, what's there and where's it going. And if they have that, and then I can quickly look at where it's going out of state and see that it's going to a licensed business, then yeah, hands off. But that's really hard to do, to be quite honest, especially roadside. So they'll call me, and usually I police my cubicle. It's a very safe cubicle. I don't know where my handcuffs are, so I Google really quick for them, and I'll figure out best I can if it's going from Oregon's regulated system to California or another regulated system. But there's definitely got to be documentation involved in that. So Senate Bill 1057, this did all kinds of things. It changed some medical limits. It did a whole bunch of different things. 2197, that was kind of like an agreement with the sovereign nations of Oregon, the reservations. They wanted to grow marijuana, but they didn't want the state to tax them and then also tax them again if they sold it at the retail level through the OLCC. So we kind of came to an agreement wherein they the state can't tax them. Their product is taxed at the retail, and then that retailer is able to deduct taxes and give them back to the reservation. So 2198, that's another big bill and tweaks the other bill, Senate Bill 1057. So it was funny because Senate Bill 1057 went into effect at the end of May, and it decreased some possession limits for medical marijuana. And then on August 4th, Senate Bill 2198 came back in, and it changed those again. So that's an example of the moving target that we had there. And just in that one, a medical patient is allowed 6 plants, and then 6 mature plants, and then 12 immature plants. Prior to Senate Bill 1057 passing, you were allowed 6 mature plants and an unlimited number, millions of unlimited immature plants. I used to tell people, so they can have 6 mature plants and they can have more immature plants than God. Because you can have as many as you want. Well, we fixed that so you could have 2-to-1 ratio. You could have 6 mature plants and 12 immature plants. And I was like, score, this is reasonable. And then Senate Bill 2198 comes back through a couple months later, and it says, okay, so you get 6 mature plants, you get 12 immature plants over 24 inches tall, and under 24 inches, you can have more plants than God. So it becomes really problematic. You can see how this becomes really problematic for law enforcement. And there's all kinds of great questions. I mean, if I was worried about that, I'd have like my million plants and I'd just chop them off at 24 inches, and I'd do that, and I'd make them really wide. Yeah, they're 23 inches tall, but they're 6 feet wide. It's called sea green, and it's a very legitimate way to grow marijuana. Yes, sir.
I just need to demonstrate my stupidity on this. It's just my unfamiliarity. Marijuana plant.
Yes.
Will it last like for 50 years? Is there a cycle? I mean, when we talk about mature versus immature, is it self-limiting?
No. Okay. So yes and no. It depends. Thank you, Mr. Whitford. So are you growing it indoors or outdoors? If you're growing it indoors, you can control the light cycle and everything, and you can make it live in perpetuity. Otherwise, it's something that you're going to need to replant annually.
If it's a crop, they replant it, but if the plant itself will continue to grow.
Yes, sir.
I have a question, though. You're allowed to have 6 mature plants, 6 or 12 immature. Well, aren't the immature all going to grow to mature? Are you going to have 12 now instead of 6?
Yeah, but so here's the thought on that. There's a couple of reasons why that is, and they're very good reasons if we want to look at marijuana as an industry and we want to look at growth. So first of all, we only want the female plants, only the sinsemilla, the ones without the seeds, right? So just like humans, let's figure 50% of them are going to be men. Well, that accounts for why you get 12 immature, because 50% of them might not be viable. Also, when you look at the purposes of hybridizing strains, combining strains, grafting, cloning, all these other reasons to get those 6 mature plants, the growers, the people who cultivate cannabis, feel as though they need a bigger gene pool. So that's one reason. The other reason could be profit. You know, even though you're not allowed to make money from medical marijuana, it absolutely could be. So we're trying to find a middle ground here, wherein it's kind of an ollie oxen free right now. Amnesty come in to be legal because I don't know if you know this, guys, but the genie's out of the bottle. People realize that Oregon has good cannabis. We have a national following. So we could go along with what we were doing, which wasn't working, or we could allow a legal avenue. So there's a lot of instances where the law doesn't cover something or looks the other way, and the goal is to bring people into compliance. So it's kind of like saying to the bank robber, you know, we're not going to prosecute you if you just come back and give us some of our money back. I mean, it's you know, there's no way to do it. But if you were looking at hundreds of bank robbers, that's what you'd have to do. If you can't beat them, join them. So anyway, the last one was the tax distribution bill. And when I spoke about the state school fund, they moved it to a different state school fund so that you could actually distribute that 40% on an annual basis. So this is the current law until the short session, which I'm sure we'll tweak it again. So what can you have recreationally? This is adult use. This is any of you out there, all right? So you can have, per household, up to 4 plants. You can have 8 ounces of usable marijuana. You can have 16 ounces of solids, 16 ounces of concentrates, 72 ounces of liquids. Now the difference between concentrates and liquids, that's going to be 72 ounces of topicals, shampoo, salve, lotion, that kind of stuff. And 1 ounce of an extract. That has to be a legal extract, and that to be legal, that has to be produced by either an Oregon Medical Marijuana or an Oregon Liquor Control Commission processor. So you can't do any homemade extracts. Extract and a concentrate, since I've got this up, I'll tell you the difference. Concentrates are things like tinctures. They are made with non-hydrocarbon-based solvents. They can be made with isopropyl alcohol, Everclear or grain alcohol, vegetable oil, ice water. All of those things would be called concentrates, and those are legal to produce at home for non-commercial purposes. Great example of this, taking a bunch of weed, throwing it in a bunch of butter, and letting it steep, and then making brownies out of it. You can have that liquid, up to 16 ounces of it, at home for non-commercial purposes. Now extracts, there's a difference. These are made with hydrocarbon-based solvents, such as propane, butane, or hexane. The difference between extracts and concentrates will cause you to have a kitchen fire. Extracts will cause your kitchen to blow up. So that's the biggest difference, right? That's the best way to remember the difference between the two. One's going to catch your house on fire, one's going to blow your house, and probably your neighbors up too. So, getting back to what you can currently have, you get to have up to 1 ounce of marijuana in a public place. That includes your car. It is my contention that a car is a public place. There's been some back and forth about that, but I see a car on a highway as a public place, much like I'd see a backpack on a highway as being in a public place. It has nothing to do with a person's right to privacy and whether or not I need a warrant to get in that car, but it's 1 ounce in a public place, and there's some good case law to back that one up, but it all depends on which district attorney you talk to. And that's unfortunately where we're at in the state of marijuana law, is we don't have case law to back it up. So, for instance, when I say, no, outside of your house, 1 ounce, that's it, in a public place, that's all you can have, even if it's in your car, I'll get arguments about it. But since we don't have case law, I have to go find the supporting case law and look at the legislative intent. And that one's easy because I found a weapons case that said a car was a public place. So, but some of these aren't easy, and some of them we won't decide for years and years and years. So,
are distributors able to sell or provide to a person in store more than 1 ounce at a time?
no.
Okay.
No, they're not, unless, and okay, this is for recreation. Depends, unless they hold a medical card. And then they can have 2 pounds. So,
1 ounce to 2 pounds.
yeah. So, And I'll tell you why. The 24 ounces is your medical limit. So that's my medicine. That's 1.5 pounds. And then 8 ounces is my recreational limit. So, so I guess they could sell up to 25 ounces to a person at a dispensary. If the dispensary was qualified to sell both medical and recreational, then I could get my 24 ounces of medical and then my 1 ounce of recreational, because those Measure 91 said our recreational laws aren't going to affect our medical laws, so we have to put a line there. And so you get your 25 ounces. Now, if they were at home and I came in there and I was in there for whatever reason and I saw over 2 pounds, then that medical license cardholder would be over their amount. There's not necessarily a remedy under the law for that because it's their medicine, but still. Yes, sir.
So if a vehicle is a public place,
Uh-huh.
and if you're driving a commercial vehicle, that's federal.
So a vehicle is in a public place. It's not a public place, but public places are defined as streets, highways, common areas of apartment buildings and hotels. So it's a fine designation there, but I just want to clarify that I'm not saying that a vehicle is a public place, like you don't have a right to go into his vehicle and say, well, it's a public place. No, that vehicle is in a public place, and everything inside that vehicle is in a public place, but he still has a right to privacy. And that becomes important for me when I want to get into that vehicle, because his right to privacy trumps my knowing that he's got marijuana in a public place. At that point, I take a piece of paper called an affidavit to a judge, and we let him decide whether or not I have probable cause to collect evidence and to violate his right to privacy. So a real fine designation, but very important to make.
So, yeah, okay, so defining that, then how does that affect the transportation of marijuana for, recreational dispensaries and that?
Yeah, so you're not going to do it in a vehicle over 10,000 pounds subject to federal motor carrier safety regulations, that's for sure. Anything that or a vehicle over 26,000 pounds that you need a CDL for, that's for sure, because federal law is very clear on that. So these are it's all transported, but still, 500 pounds of weed's a lot of weed, and you can fit that in the back of your SUV.
That's over the 1 ounce though, so if you...
Sure, but you're probably have an OLCC license, or we'll get into some of these possession amounts are pretty ridiculous. So let me keep going here, because we're going to talk about. With 10 minutes? Okay, we're going to talk about medicine here really quick. We're almost done, actually. This is a visual aid for you guys from Portland Police Bureau. That's a voodoo donut there, and that's basically the breakdown, right? You got 1 ounce, that's legal on a person. 8 ounces legal in your household, and 1 pound just illegal. Depends though on if you have a medical card, because then this doesn't apply to you. So,
How much weed does a person with medical marijuana smoke? Or how often do they go back or whatever? Is it a lot? Can you go back every day?
yes, you can. Anyone here can go into an OLCC recreational dispensary and buy 1 ounce of marijuana per day. I'm not aware that there's anything that connects them. So if you want to go into, and there's dispensaries like every 1,000 feet. so if you wanted to go down the line and just buy 1 ounce at each one of them, you could probably do that. At this point, I'm not aware of anything that connects them, and that there's anything that would prevent you from doing that.
You just don't get pulled over with all of it in your car.
Exactly. Or if you do, make sure you get pulled over by a cop that thinks that 8 ounces is allowed in your car, and not me that thinks that only 1 ounce is allowed in your car, right? let's get back to this because I want to finish up and maybe take some more questions. But so Senate Bill 302, this is really important that we touch on this because it becomes important when I talk about employment law, which I have no idea anything about, but I'm going to attempt to point out something that I did. So it removes marijuana from Oregon's Controlled Substances Act. This is very important because when you look at something like DUI, let's look at the section B at the very end, is under the influence of intoxicating liquor, a controlled substance, or inhalant. But marijuana is not a controlled substance anymore, right? So when we took marijuana out of the Controlled Substances Act, we had to put it back in over 350 different statutes, right? And there were some places that they didn't want to put it back, like some of your professional licensing boards. They didn't want to put marijuana back in there, so they wanted to be able to smoke marijuana and still have their license as a nurse or a teacher or what have you. I don't know the status of those because that's not my gig. My gig is criminal laws. So this is what it looks like. Threw cannabis back in there to make sure that we could still arrest you for being DUI cannabis. Again, they did that in about 350 places. Senate Bill 302 also created superpossession amounts for over 8 pounds in public, over 12 plants at your household, or over 2 times the limit for concentrates or products. This is important because when we first fixed this in 2015 in what we call House Bill 3400, it was impossible to reach a felony level, and it's important to be able to reach a felony level for many reasons. One, as a deterrent. So we actually got some felony level crimes put back into the laws through Senate Bill 302. And then we strengthened the import-export law. We were running into this at the airport and also like next to the border. You got a guy, he's got 100 pounds of weed in the back of his car. Keep in mind, it's only a misdemeanor at this time, and he's 100 feet from the border. And we say, what are you doing? He's like, oh, nothing. It's like, yeah, but you're 100 feet from the border, and you've got Idaho plates and an Idaho driver's license. Yeah, I'm not doing anything. So here's your misdemeanor citation about the level of a DUI, and don't you dare drive across the border with 100 pounds of weed that's worth about $200,000 to $300,000. Yeah, it didn't work. So what we did is we said putting marijuana in any mode of transportation for hire constitutes an export. That helped us for our parcel cases. You know, that's a very popular way to get it out of the state, is you write a fake return address and a real shipping address, but a fake name, and you stick it in a box and you walk away. That's a great way to do it. Well, I couldn't do anything because you're in Oregon. It wasn't illegal for you to do that. You were intending to export it, but we would be hard-pressed to prove intent and charge all these intent to commit export of marijuana cases for a Class A misdemeanor. So we made it a felony, and we said just, here's another one. Did you know you can book a plane ticket to wherever, roll in there with your suitcase, check your suitcase, and then walk out of the airport and not get on the plane? And so we were getting a lot of suitcases that were going to the Midwest all by themselves. And so this is how we fix that. So the other thing we got is arson 1 and arson 2 incident to the manufacture of a cannabis extract. Prior to Senate Bill 302, if you blew up your house because you were trying to make hash oil, we could charge you with reckless burning, and we were losing those cases because even though it says don't use around open flame, don't puncture, extremely flammable, all that stuff, the mental state of recklessness or the act of being reckless, we were having a hard time proving that. And at a Class A misdemeanor, nobody was really keen on spending all their resources to prosecute it. So we're just losing these cases left and right, but they're blowing up their landlord's house and they're blowing up their apartment and the one next to it. So we've got this one right here. yeah, so we had reckless burning and federal prosecution. So, you know, you had a slap on the hand or like time in the big house. You know, there was no middle ground. And now we've got the middle ground. This is not like arson 1 and arson 2. This is a separate statute. It resides within the drug statutes. And the reason is Measure 11 and mandatory minimum sentencing. So we were able to get this in, but you got to trade stuff with the marijuana lobby to get these things in, and that was the trade, is we weren't going to look for a mandatory minimum sentence there. Speaking of DUI and Measure, or Senate Bill 302, nothing's changed, really. We had to put it back into the DUI statute and call out cannabis specifically, but Oregon arrests are based on impairment and not a per se limit. In some states, they'll ask you to blow in a portable breath test on the side of the road. We don't do that in Oregon. What we do is we ask you to stand on one leg, walk a straight line, look at our finger. If we don't get what the test results that we're expecting to see based on the level of impairment, we might ask you to do a couple of other tests, which close your eyes and tilt your head backwards, do some other stuff, touch your nose. So those are all tests that have been scientifically studied and are designed to measure impairment. We arrest based on impairment, and then we take you back and we say, hey, would you like to honk into this machine and let me see if you have like 0.08 or more? And if you did, it was per se, it was assumed then that if you were over 0.08 that you were drunk. So that's not what we have with cannabis. Cannabis in Washington, they have a 5 nanogram per milliliter whole blood content as a per se limit. Colorado is very similar. Juries are given instruction that it should be a reasonable inference that if they have 5 nanograms per milliliter of whole blood in their bloodstream, that it could be inferred that they were under the influence. Oregon says, hey, wait a second. We got some guys that smoke some weed here, like a lot of it. And there's a chance you could catch them on a day that they haven't smoked any weed, but if you check their blood, they'd be over this limit. So that's why we arrest based on impairment. I parallel this to controlled substances. There is nothing that I can do to test how much oxycodone you have in your system, for instance. And there's 100 prescription medications that would cause you to drive impaired. We can't measure all of those, so we don't. We look at impairment levels, and that's very important. It becomes important to you guys as citizens because if you're dumb and can't follow directions, or if you're physically disabled, you're not going to perform as well on those field sobriety tests. So that's something to keep in mind if you find yourself being asked to stand on one leg for 30 seconds. That's something that the officer should also take into account, and that the courts will also take into account too. But it might not keep you out of handcuffs that night. So, federal motor carrier, nothing's changed there. It's still no tolerance. You can't even have it in the car or the truck. Same with alcohol. Can't even have it in the truck. So, medical laws. I'm gonna hit warp speed here because we want to finish. But medical laws, you got 6 plants per patient, 2 patients per grower, and 4 growers per location, depending on within or without city limits, residential area or not. There's a bunch of other things that come into play there, but it is quite possible for 4 growers to be registered at a grow site, each having 2 patients. That gets you 8 patients or 48 mature marijuana plants. You get 96 immature plants over 96 inches tall, and you get an unlimited number under 24 inches. So the good news with these 2 bills that came through is if you got over 12 plants, we're going to put an RFID tag on all your plants, and you're going to self-report. Yes, it's self-reporting, but you're going to report to the OLCC seed to sale tracking system. That's the thing that we put in place to keep recreational marijuana under tabs. And now this is the first time that we're going to have any kind of tracking of the medical system. But it still could be considered to be out of control because you get your 24 ounces because of your card, you get your 8 ounces of rec, that means you can have 2 pounds. But if you grow for yourself, you get 6 pounds per indoor plant or 12 pounds per outdoor plant. So again, if I get 6 plants because I'm growing for myself, I get 72 pounds of dried marijuana if I grew the plants outdoors. Now 72 pounds of marijuana, again, an Oregon average price is $1,000 to $2,000 a pound. If you take that to the Midwest, you're gonna be looking at $3,000 to $4,000 a pound. If you get it into the heart of Boston or the heart of New York City, you can get up to $6,000 a pound. And you can carry all 72 pounds of this marijuana in your car if you have a medical grower's
That's
card.
72 pounds includes stems and seeds and plants and leaves and all kinds of stuff.
Usable marijuana, which is going to be the leaf and flower. So, but most commonly we'd run into it as dried marijuana product, which is just straight bud. So, it's a huge amount, and some think that the medical laws are the source of all of our diversion problems. I'm not going to tell you my opinion. Let's see, Mr. Whitford talked a lot about this, but I want to point out something that I discovered at OSP. When Senate Bill 302 was going to pass and they were going to take it out of the Controlled Substances Act, our union was also entering bargaining. And I was just looking at the contract, and I read through it, and it was like, wait a second. See, we weren't prohibited from using controlled substances per the Federal Controlled Substances Act. We were prohibited from using controlled substances per the State Controlled Substances Act, right? So that's ORS 475005. Well, once we took, this had an emergency clause, so the minute that the governor signed it, it went into effect. Well, it takes forever to bargain with the union, right? And so I raised my hand, I'm like, problem, guys. You know, there's an argument to be made, it probably wouldn't fly, that a trooper could smoke marijuana because our drug and alcohol policy says illegal use of controlled substances, and one, marijuana is legal, and the use of it's legal, and two, it's not a controlled substance per state definition. And it was a very easy sale to align our drug and alcohol policy with the Federal Controlled Substance Act, U.S. Code 21. And so we did that really quickly. And there were other implications here. We found that we were probably not eligible for federal contracts that we'd been working for a long time. You know, a lot of these ODOT road jobs will have troopers working overtime. Well, that trooper is paid for in part by a federal grant. I'm a Department of Homeland Security task force officer, and my overtime is paid for by the Department of Homeland Security. So we were probably violating a lot more than just that. So the future, Senate Bill 301 went down in a ball of flames. A lot of it was due to this Emerald Steel Fabricators versus Boley, but that wanted to make it an unlawful practice to fire or not hire someone for off-duty use of marijuana. It got a hearing, and it actually got out of committee, but it got out of committee, everyone knowing that it would implode. The thing about that is we have a law in Oregon that says it's an unlawful employment practice to not hire someone or fire someone because they use cigarettes, because of nicotine. Well, they just wanted to tack cannabis right in there. And I was actually kind of amazed about the cigarette law, but that's the power of a lobby. I guarantee that an employer didn't write that law. I guarantee that a legislator didn't write that law. I would imagine that the tobacco lobby wrote the law saying that you can't get not hired or get fired for cigarettes. Well, we were going to try to throw marijuana in there, and yeah, the trucking companies, they lined up out the door saying, how are you going to do this? And people brought up the federal supremacy clause. In other words, conflict of state law and federal law wins. So the future, and this is about it, social consumption. You know, we're going to overproduce marijuana. We have no way to limit licensees. We can only limit canopy size, OLCC can. Plus, we have the medical system. We're just going to have more weed than we can smoke. I mean, the last time I looked at it, you literally had to, I mean, every man, woman, and child had to smoke 1/8 of marijuana a day, which is a lot.
Does it go bad, like people?
It degrades, but not if stored properly, not if cured and stored properly. Yeah, you can get high off of it. You might.
Stores, are they losing money if people aren't buying?
No, they'll be okay, I'm sure.
Tax revenue last year,
yeah.
people are buying.
Yeah, so social consumption, you know, we got to smoke more, so hey, let's throw an event and let's everybody smoke. That's one thought. They tried to bring social consumption in with 2 different bills. They both went out partially due to Clean Air Act laws. They wanted to smoke weed inside, but we won't even let you smoke cigarettes inside. So that became a problem with the county health officials that regulate that. One regulatory authority. I really see a future where medical marijuana that's, I mean, we took a positive step toward getting them regulated by OLCC when we made them track farms or grow sites with over 12 plants. I see it going that way. Increase in use rates, the data's out there. It's going up, it's creeping up, both in child and adult. High school use is way up. You know, an interesting fact, I just came from the National Cannabis Summit, which was more of a public health summit in Denver than law enforcement, but 80% of the marijuana is smoked by 20% of the users. That's an interesting fact. And then out-of-state investment. Right now, you've got to be a state resident to get an OLCC license, but I have lots of information about business partnerships, and you've got a lot of out-of-state money coming in. So with that, I'll leave you with the picture. This was just a few months ago down in Cave Junction. Nobody did anything about it.
I was rolling on the 2 weeks ago, and this girl's there rolling one and lit up.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yes, sir.
Okay, with the legalizing of marijuana, is there still a black market where they don't pay taxes?
Yep.
I know-
Some would argue that that it's grown, but I don't know. We tried to look at that, and it wasn't well received. So that's something for the academics and economists, and not for the police. But yeah, I can tell you that the black market is thriving.
Two super random questions. One, growers and any regulations of youth or children in those settings if it's grown at home.
Yeah, so OLCC licensees, absolutely not. Anyone there is going to have like a server's permit for alcohol. They're going to have a marijuana worker's permit. So OLCC, absolutely not. Medical grows are allowed at your private residence, and because of that, I can't control whether or not you have a firearm, whether or not your kids are around it. None of that applies. That's your personal residence. They have every right that you have there. Yeah, yeah.
Or growing on behalf of a cardholder.
Yeah.
Same-
Yeah, and I get that a lot. A lot of times it's like the ex, hey, I don't want my kids to go to my ex-husband's house because he's got a marijuana grow. It's like, oh, sorry. Just make sure that your kids aren't coming home high, because then you can do something about it. But if yeah, exactly.
Are there issues with the money handling of this industry with them really insured and whatever banking?
Oh, there's huge issues. That's another 45-minute presentation, to be quite honest. I won't even venture to get into that, but we pay our taxes in Oregon in bags of money at the counter at the Department of Revenue, and there's a bunch of old retired state troopers, both in uniform and undercover, that stand all around there because bags of $10,000 to $100,000 are being laid on the counter.
And is
So-
it, I mean, the whole industry is not paying federal tax on it, because it's,
They're trying to. They're trying to. Yeah, there's all kinds of problems. There's, you know, these aren't necessarily business people in all cases, so I think there's going to be some big tax implications down the road. I think the dispensaries that have their stuff together are paying their federal taxes they can, but you see, they pay a higher federal tax rate if they're paying it, because they get to write off the cost of goods sold. They don't get to write off electricity and all the ancillary stuff. It's an IRS 283E regulation. Because what happened is back in New York, a gangster got popped, and they said, hey, you know, your money laundering charge, you've laundered, you know, billions of dollars. And he came in and he's like, no, you know, I had to pay $100,000 for that hit. I had to pay for the drugs that I was selling. I had to pay for this. And he was able to deduct from what the government said he owed his cost of doing illegal business. So the IRS is like, huh, we got outsmarted, we better change this and we better do this. And so that's what we got. They don't get the deductions right now. So the smart people are paying that huge tax bill, and if they're not able to pay that tax bill for whatever reason because they're afraid of prosecution, then they're setting it aside because at some time Uncle Sam's gonna say, hey, tax bill's due yesterday. So.